Hello and welcome to Happy Hour. It is Tuesday, April 9th. It is a special Tuesday night happy hours because, as I just mentioned, I am flying out tomorrow morning to go visit my mom and dad. So I will be doing some enjoyable time in the airport, which is always a delight. And then we'll jump into things. So we have a few different questions today to sort of talk about, and we will work our way through them. So the first one actually comes from Alyssa, who wanted some inside scoop on some dirt that went down at Creative Inc. And so I thought I would give people the lowdown on that. So what ended up happening is I ended up getting a call from my film agent in LA to let me know that Netflix, and in particular production team at Netflix, is interested in making With Malice into a film. So that is exciting. Jazz hands all around. So what does that mean and how does that work and what's actually happening? So first off, everyone else is super excited, whereas I am only tentatively excited. And that is because I have been around the block before with film people. So film people have this tendency to be super excited. So when you meet them, it is all like they have never seen you before in your life, but they love you and they want to be family with you and they think you're a genius. And the very first time that I went through this, I was like, I am just days away from moving to LA and getting a house by the ocean because everything was like, and I'm not joking when I do this, like, Eileen, we love your work. Your stuff is great. Like, it just screams big screen. And I'm like, yes, it does scream big screen, doesn't it? And you know, that never got made either. So they do a lot of talking, although I will say that one group did pony up money. So to date, Netflix has not put cash on the table. So until there is cash on the table, I am always very tentative. What did happen, which is fairly good news, is that my film person went back to some other places that were looking at it and said, we have interest from Netflix, you better shake a tree. So Amazon has now come back and said that they are interested in making With Malice into a film. So not as we speak, because I'm guaranteed nothing is happening at this moment, but in theory, they are all chatting around about what will happen, and we will see. Sometimes when there is that kind of competition, things do happen a little bit quicker because someone's afraid they're possibly going to get scooped. So it is my hope that somebody ponies up some cash on the table to lock in the deal, because at this moment, we don't have anything.
So would that be they would option it?
They would option it. So okay. Let me explain what an option deal looks like. So an option deal is when someone comes forward to you and says, I want to make some kind of screen project. So whether that's a film, a TV show, a made-for-TV movie, a TV series, a live action play, any of those kinds of what they're called dramatic rights, and they want to option it for that purpose. To option it is almost like they're putting it on layaway. Is anyone old enough to remember layaway? Tony, you must be.
Yes. Yeah, thank you.
There's a few of us who are still like, I remember layaway. Doesn't happen anymore, but in the olden days when you couldn't afford something, you would put it on layaway and you would pay a little bit each sort of week or month, and then eventually you could get that item out of layaway. So basically, an option deal allows a production company to put your project on hold. That is, that you cannot have anyone else make it into a film, TV show, etc., while they hold the option rights. So what they typically want to do is to have the option right for as long as possible. What you want to do is have a shorter option amount because that gives you more flexibility. So that's usually one of the issues that is being negotiated. The second thing that is being negotiated is what is the terms of the option. And you will see options as low as $1. So you will see some places that are, it's a producer who's basically trying to get cash on the table. So he wants the rights. So he can't go out after people who have money in the film industry until he has the rights. So they will want to option it. And you'll particularly see that with a lot of smaller production companies. They'll want to option it. You may want to do that. If you don't have someone else who's indicated film interest, you may be willing to do the option agreement for a very low amount, but we'll talk about what you would want at the end of it. But the option amount is some amount of money for them to hold it for a period of time. it's usually 1 to 2 years is what it ends up being negotiated as. During that 1 to 2 years, that is their time to try and basically make something happen. So in order to get something to happen, they have to get money committed to it. There's usually what you hear called getting attachments. So you'll hear that, Benedict Cumberbatch has agreed to attach himself to this, this particular role, or a particular director will sort of attach themselves to the project. That doesn't mean that they might not still do it. So you'll often hear about, they will sort of attach themselves to it, but then they might take the next Avengers movie and then they're not, in fact, free to do that anymore. So until there's an actual production date, you'll see some people sort of attaching themselves in and out of projects. And that is also something that will happen. So I have one friend who is in, we call it the never-ending option hell. But initially, Reese Witherspoon was involved. And then Reese Witherspoon walked away from the project. And then it was another actress. And then that person walked away from the project. And then another person attached themselves to the project. So sometimes that is happening. As a writer, sometimes you don't care if things are caught in what we call the endless, option hell. Because if the option expires, the production group has to either renew that option or they have to let it go. So I do know one science fiction writer who comes quite frequently to Surrey, and he's had a project optioned for the last 15 years, and his option strike price is 20 grand every year. So every year they come back and they renew it. And he was like, I don't care if they ever make it. Like, screw it. Like, just keep paying me that money every year. That's unusual. Typically, they will let an option lapse at some point, but sometimes if they're close but not quite there, they will option for an extended period of time. So the option is usually just your first bit of money. The second bit of money that you would get as the writer is when things actually go into production. So you're getting another chunk of change that'll be negotiated at that point. And then the third piece of chunk of change that you get is when something actually comes out on release, whether that's on TV or Amazon or so forth. And you're getting paid different amounts at that. You will see some production companies that will say, well, we don't have a lot of money to give you up front, but what we will do is give you a percentage of the receipts once it goes to the theaters. In general, every advice I've gotten is don't get too attached to that idea, because film production has a way of almost always being negative. Like even films like Lord of the Rings on the books show that they lost money kind of things. So getting your money off the back end is usually not a great idea. The other thing that your film agent is negotiating is basically the money is the biggest one, but then they're also negotiating what is the size that your name's going to appear in the credits. What happens, if anything, like if there's merchandising associated with your book. So you can imagine if you wrote Star Wars or the Harry Potter series, you want a cut of all of those action figures and various things based on your characters. Negotiating possibly the rights if they want to do a sequel, even if there isn't necessarily a sequel initially planned. So I don't know if anyone watched Big Little Lies by Leanne Moriarty. Great thriller with Nicole Kidman and so forth. When she wrote that, there was no sequel. It was a standalone book. That TV show did extraordinarily well. They wanted to do a second season, and she had in her contract that she got to do some. So she wrote a novella that the second season is being based on, but that wasn't initially her intention. So there's usually some kind of wording about if they want to continue on, what they have to do or how they have to do that. So that may be included in there as well. So all of that is happening. What I can tell you, I've been around the option tree a few times with different projects. Sometimes I've gotten money out of it. Sometimes I haven't. Is that it definitely, when you're in it, they are very good. Maybe it's because they're dramatic people. But I did one, which I don't think is talking out of school, where I went to New York. I was flown to New York by MTV Books or MTV Studios, and they were talking about doing something based on one of my books. And I went into a meeting. And so first off, it was quite clear to me within 2 or 3 minutes of this meeting that the guy who was the big cheese had never in his life ever read my book. It was The Education of Haley Kendrick, which, if anyone knows, it's a boarding school story. So that was the book that they were talking about. It was quite clear to me that his assistant was the one who had read the book and thought it was a possible project. So first off, he kept calling me Elizabeth, which is my middle name. And he would say things like, Elizabeth, loved the book, loved it. What's the name? And the assistant would have, Haley, what a great character. Can't imagine an actress that isn't going to want to play Haley, right? All right, Elizabeth. So what I'm thinking is, and then he would sort of talk, and then it was, I don't know how else to describe it. It was just very bizarre. He was like, I like that there's no paranormal. There's too much paranormal stuff. I'm sick of, well, vampires and wizards and all this. But, like if it had a ghost. And I was like, what? So there was this whole circular, very odd conversation that went on for 2.5 hours. And I remember when I left, I thought, nothing is going to happen, because the guy who's actually the decision maker has never read the book, clearly has no idea what he's looking for. The person who liked the book was clearly a much lower level person. And I was right, nothing ever happened. But they did fly me out to New York, and, I got to see MTV Studios, which, as a kid from the 80s was pretty damn cool. But it was that thing where, and now again, I've been around it before, where, they call and there's, they love it. It's great. It's some of the best writing they've seen, and people are going to love it. And you're just so excited. And then they're kind of like, ooh, shiny squirrel, right? And they're on to the next thing occasionally. So it can be very hard to see that interest last. So that's why I am only cautiously optimistic. So I'm very happy that Netflix has reached out. I would love for them to make a movie, but I am not counting any Netflix chickens until they hatch. As a writer with basically a small amount of clout, like not a big, I am not J.K. Rowling, you're also going to have to decide how much leeway you want to give them. So you'll sometimes see movies like based on a book by such and such, and it's, been aged up and set in space, and like they can take a book at some point and basically almost do whatever they want with it. You very rarely, as an author, are going to be given script approval. You'll typically get what they call script consultation, which means they do run it by you. So someone lets you see that and kind of see what's going on. But in many cases, you're kind of surrendering the idea that they might do something really ranged. Now, you can say, I will not do that, but then they may not go for it. So something to keep in mind. Questions on film options?
Cash. What's the cash? Or what, typically what, from a unknown author to like a big, I'm thinking a big author like a James Patterson or whatever, get big bucks, but.
Yeah. So, I can give like my first option deal, which was with a major studio, was a $10,000 option. They did renew it once, so I got $20,000. If they had gone to production, I would have gotten $200,000, and then if it came out, I would have gotten an extra $50,000 on top of that. So that was all of that. I've also done an option with a very small production company where she optioned it for $1,500, and then I would get a percentage of the eventual film budget, but basically if they were going through telefilm, so they were hoping to get something made for $1 million. So I can guarantee you my cut of that would have been probably about 22,000, I think we figured out. So you will see kind of all over the map. There is no doubt if you've written a huge bestseller that people are dying to see the film of, i.e. The Hunger Games or something like that, you're going to get a much bigger deal.
So someone at Creative Inc., I don't remember who, said that roughly 1% of things that are optioned are made. Have you heard that, or is that just something they pulled out of their butt?
I haven't heard that, but I don't know their buttocks intimately to know whether or not that's where that detail came from. A lot of things are optioned, but not necessarily made. So if you're finding basically publishing frustrating, ho, ho, ho. Wait till you get to the world of film. Like if you think about how many books come out every week from the major publishing houses, it's probably about 50 books a week coming out between nonfiction and fiction and across their different lines and so forth. And then you think about how many films come out each week. It's probably 2 to 4. And a lot of those are Avengers 15. So that's not necessarily something new. So there's, far fewer things that are getting made, particularly original new content. There's definitely a leaning towards, what they would call known IP. So making movies about Legos or a video game versus kind of a unique story. Having said that, with the growth of places like Netflix and Amazon and more places looking to do kind of streamed stories, I think you are seeing a much different market open up, right? So you're seeing something where something like Big Little Lies is getting produced by HBO, where it's like, okay, we're going to take a complex book and do a 10-episode show about it. That didn't used to be an option. They either made a major theater production or they did kind of a made-for-TV movie, which was not necessarily the same thing. So I think we are seeing some different venues open. Keep in mind that all kinds of things get optioned, including short stories. Often short stories make great films because they are much more condensed. So keeping in mind, again, depending what your book is, you only have usually 2 hours, maybe 2.5 for a film. So you're going to be doing basically a much smaller thing. You'll also see a lot of nonfiction articles that get optioned for film. So for example, there was one that was in some newspaper down in California did a article about women in prison who get hired to be firefighters. I don't know if people remember this when the wildfires were going on. The prison system has this thing where if you volunteer to be a firefighter, you can get some time off your sentence and a little thing. So there's some debate about whether or not that's evil and wrong, because you're basically making people do a life-threatening job with the idea that they might get out and they're not getting paid for that. So it saves the state a lot of money. So they interviewed all these different women and, why they were in jail and what they were doing. And it ended up, they've at least gone to production, at least at some point, with making that. So if you're interested at all in kind of the world of film, I would highly recommend the podcast Script Notes. One, it's just funny to listen to. They also have some great stuff on story in general. But they are two screenwriters, John August and Craig Mazin. Craig Mazin did the Hangover movies and a couple other different things that you would know. John August did, of course, now I'm blanking on the title. He did Big Fish was one of his, and he's done some others. So they're kind of interesting to listen to. And one of the things that they do is, would it make a movie? And so they go through various newspaper articles and things and talk about what a spin would be to make that a story. And I find that somewhat interesting because they talk about, for example, the firefighter one was one that they did. And they talked about, do you have it from the point of view of these different women? Do you have it from somebody who works at the jail? Is it an action film or is it more of a personal film? Blah, blah, blah. So they were kind of doing it. So of course, obviously they're going to make up characters for a film, but they're just basing it on that story. So they've actually optioned the newspaper article. Or if you remember, Catch Me If You Can had Leo, what's his name in it. That initially started as an article about a con artist. It eventually became a book about that con artist and then eventually a film as well. So they actually do that fairly often if there's kind of an interesting thing that way. So I would invite people to take out Script Notes if they like.
I don't know, has anyone else heard that apparently The Handmaid's Tale, Margaret Atwood didn't get a penny when that was made into a TV show? I don't know more about the story than that, but it was on a podcast where they were talking about that. And I'm just wondering if maybe back in the day that maybe rights were sold indefinitely, or?
Yeah, I would be surprised by that. She may not have gotten much, because I could imagine, again, when that book came out, I think in the early 80s.
Yeah. So maybe, sorry, she didn't get a penny with the new series that came out. So
yeah.
There was a film made back in the day.
Yeah. She would have gotten, but she still should have gotten something, but it may have been, it was optioned for a very low amount initially, and it kind of had renewed, and eventually they did it. And so she didn't get a ton. I do find it interesting. She has decided to write a second book. I don't know if people know that. There's going to be a Handmaid 2, which I will find very interesting. And it'll be also interesting to see how that diverges now from the TV show, because the TV show is now in uncharted war out of waters, similar to Game of Thrones, where they started initially and then have now kind of gone off on their own direction. So stay tuned. Yeah. So you should get something. And again, like any other kind of foreign rights, your publisher may hold them, but they still have to pay you out of that, right? So they can take it against your advance potentially, but they still have to pay you, even though they may hold the film rights. So that's just something to consider. Any other questions on film and option? All right, so I want you all to consider your fingers crossed, and I will keep you all posted as to what happens, and we shall see. So nobody's shown me any money yet, but I am happy that we have interest from Amazon as well, because I am hoping that will kind of juice people into wanting to do something. So what did you find out, Tony? Is that the sequel, or is that the...
No, it says, Margaret Atwood says, Handmaid's Tale TV show profits went to MGM, not her. She said she did not have a negotiating position after selling the rights of her novel to MGM for a 1990 film so she sold them in 1990 and they kept them forever, I guess. So, but it's interesting. It's an interesting article. It's a short one.
Well, and I think it's also that interesting thing to think about. I think as writers, we sometimes get the pressure that like something has to happen right away, right? So Margaret Atwood wrote that book, again, back in the early 80s. Film got made. My hunch is she thought like, well, that'll be it. It's not like anyone's ever going to want to make another movie out of this thing, right? Like, and then, surprise, it kind of comes back around. So that's just always something I think as writers, we're often a little bit too quick and easy to sell our rights to things because we're just so happy that anyone wants them. So just thinking, if you do get, a local Canadian producer who's a film student and they've got no money and they want to option your book and they love it and they're passionate about it and they're going to try and do something, you may make the decision like, you know what, no one else is beating down my door. I'd love to see something happen with it. But looking really carefully at what you're signing, like, are you signing things away forever, or do they have just a set period of time to do that, or what's going to happen with that? Just so you kind of, or at least are savvy, because you might be the next Margaret Atwood.
She said her book sales are brisk, though, because of the...
Yeah.
Oh.
Well, and I know for myself, like I read The Handmaid's Tale in university, and, here's a shocking, in a women's studies class. And then, when this, no laughing, Tony. And then when this came out, I was like, oh, I want to read it again to sort of remember what it was like and so forth. And then actually went back and got the audiobook. And listen to it because it was really quite interesting. So there is
documentaries.
There is no doubt that for writers, often the biggest thing that does happen is if you're having some kind of film sale happening, is that you're actually hoping it's going to impact book sales. And that's why you will most typically see there's something in your publishing contract where they have the rights to reissue. So what wouldn't surprise me is if, fingers crossed, Netflix makes something out of With Malice, and I have no idea who they would get to star in it, but I'm going to say Benedict Cumberbatch because I want to meet him. So Benedict's going to be in it. They would redo the cover with him on it. And that's why you will often see, like when there's a film production, there's a version of the book that comes out with the actor's face on it or the movie poster in some way, because they're trying to get tie-in sales. So you will typically see that happen. So that's probably the most common part of that. All right. So I have 2 more questions to go through. So the first one is a kind of a quick one, but just worthwhile to sort of talk about, is a member who isn't here got feedback that some of her writing was overwritten, that you're overwriting. And so she wanted to kind of understand, like, what does that mean? And so I love it because it reminds me of the term, I think, Alyssa, you talked about over-workshopped, where it's like, what does that mean? Because I think people, that wasn't you, who was the over-workshopped? Kirsten. I was like, I remember hearing it. Like, what does that term mean? So overwritten, I think, is a little bit similar. And I've seen it done in sort of 2 different ways. So I'm going to describe both ways because I think people use the term interchangeably and it can mean sort of 2 different things. So the first thing where someone will talk about overwritten is if you have information that is repeated. So we have a scene where Eileen and Peggy are talking about what's going to happen and how we're going to break into the bank. And then there's the next scene where I go over to tell Tony, because he's going to be our getaway driver. And I'm repeating a lot of the same information that I talked about in the previous chapter with Peggy. So it's, for the reader, it's repetitive. Like, obviously it's all new to Tony and he needs to know that. But you can have something as short as Eileen sat down and went through all the plans she'd come up with Peggy. I don't know about that, Tony said. That sounds like a crappy plan, right? So you can just sort of sum it up. You don't need to sort of go over it again. So sometimes when we talk about overwriting, it's just that we're repeating information that doesn't need to be there. So that's the first example. The second example that I think of when I hear the terms overwritten is the idea that you just might have more detail than you need to have in the scene, that it's feeling like we're getting lost in some of the details. And I was actually having an interesting conversation with someone because we were going through a page in a book and we were reading through it, and she was like, well, why did they mention what color that person's hair is? We don't need to know that information. Isn't that overwriting? So it kind of becomes a thing of, you can argue it either way. Certainly if you're writing thrillers in particular or mysteries, be aware that details that you add lead the reader to believe they're important. So if I say, Tracy got up, she was wearing a black shirt and black pants, she headed out the door. The readers are like, she's wearing black shirt, black pants. I wonder how that's going to somehow later be interesting. And if it's not at all related to the book and there's no reason for us to know, like, does that actually add anything? If you're trying to talk about character, then if you want to say Tracy was dressed from head to toe in black, like she did every day, like a walking Grim Reaper. So I have an idea that Tracy's gone full goth, and I want to sort of set that up, that that's what she's looking like. Then that's at least adding a character detail to the scene. So that I see is valuable. But just sort of saying Peggy was wearing a pink shirt with pearl buttons, the button down the front, and a pair of two loose jeans. Like, people get lost in sort of wondering, why are you telling me that? This connects into when I talk about setting. And we've talked about, always think about not just describing a space to give space. So Alyssa has the best space right now because she has this great fireplace behind her. If I was describing that, I could say, a large tumble rock fireplace with a large half beam mantelpiece, pictures on top, but that's not necessarily adding anything to it. If I was writing this as a horror novel, I might talk about how the fireplace loomed behind her with its heavy weight, blah, blah, blah. If I wanted to be really over the top, the mantle the size of a full coffin, right? But something where I'm describing the scene, but I'm using it to add to the tension, or where I'm using the scene to sort of, again, maybe describe character. So Alyssa felt at home in the wild countryside. So it's this idea that she feels at home, or conversely, someone who might feel totally out of place. So if you were describing me at a large party, how I would see that party as someone who is kind of an introvert and not necessarily like, okay, I have to kind of navigate this space. So thinking about describing space to show character or add to the feel of something is more useful than just saying, this is the room this person is in. Then it's just description, and it can be basically overwriting. So kind of going through and asking yourself, do we need all of this? So the example, and the person gave me permission, so let me just pull it up here for myself so I can actually have it in front of me. One of the lines that this individual had is, Thomas grabbed the scrolls, crinkling them in the middle, and stormed towards the door, still the mad bull looking for a tree to ram. So this was one of the lines that got flagged as overwritten. And we talked about that. So Thomas grabbed the scrolls, crinkling them in the middle, stormed towards the door, still the mad bull looking for a tree to ram. So we talked about, for me, what's the important part of this line is that Thomas is going to be storming out of the room, and we want to show that he's angry. But the fact that he's grabbing the scrolls, he's crinkling the middle, so he's just, grabbing them up out of the center of the thing. He's storming towards the door, and he's a mad bull. Like, all of those are hitting that same tone, and that I would probably look to trim it down to just maybe he grabbed the scrolls, stormed towards the door. Like, I might not have the mad bull, or if I loved the mad bull description, I might be like, Thomas grabbed the scrolls, leaving like a mad bull, still looking for a tree to ram. So just going to that, but having he grabbed it, he stormed, and he's a mad bull, just felt like maybe one beat too many in that line. Does that make sense? So is it the same as purple prose? I have heard it used that way as well. Purple prose is sometimes the idea of when you go even just a little too, you're channeling your English teacher's poetry workshop. So you tend to do like I wouldn't say, Thomas grabbing the scrolls, crinkling in the middle, it would be purple prose. But if it was like Thomas, his velveteen coat, lush, the nap between his fingers, he brushed it aside. But like where it's almost like when you're writing bad romance novels, I always think of that as kind of the example of purple prose, where you can't stop yourself. Like, you've got the description fairy riding you hard, and you are just sprinkling that glitter description everywhere. So you'll often hear it that way. So you'll sometimes see, but you will see it used interchangeably as well. That's why, unfortunately, like a lot of terms in writing, there's not a firm, this is what we mean when we say this thing. It just kind of becomes, there's a few different things, but that's what I would look at. If someone's saying that you're overwriting, am I repeating information? Would be one. Or am I adding so much description that I'm leading people to believe there's something that should be there that isn't, and it's coming at the cost of pacing. This particularly impacts genre. So if you're writing a historical novel set in pre-Revolutionary War France, you're probably going to put in a lot of lush details because you really want people to sort of smell what it's like and feel the streets of Paris and see all that stuff. If you're writing a thriller, you probably need to move it along a little bit more. Like, some of that is knowing your reader and what they're looking for. So I'm a huge believer in one of the best ways to learn about stuff is by reading. So, pick up a chapter of one of your favorite books that's in kind of the same genre that you're doing, and look at what kind of descriptions they're putting in there, how much descriptions, what kind of details. You can't go through I was supposed to say you can't go through the whole book. Of course you can. Just takes time, but you don't have to do the whole book. But pick a chapter like towards the beginning, and then maybe in the middle and the end, and look at kind of what they're doing and what's in there with their style. And you'll see different amounts of that description, and you can sort of start to make some decisions about what's going to work for you. And again, just that, twinkle of a warning that if you're writing any kind of mystery, if you pause to show that there's a gun on the mantelpiece, the reader is expecting that gun to go off. So they're thinking, if you tell them these details, like, oh, I need to know that. So they're kind of filing it away. And if they don't mind if you're telling them some things they don't need to know, because they're like, aha, a red herring. But if you're mentioning lots of things that they don't need to know, they actually will sort of get annoyed with you at some point, because it will feel like you're telling me things for no purpose. So that's something to consider. Questions about overwriting?
I go the other way. I go underwriting. I don't put enough details in. So that's
I do the same thing. So you learn from the master. I don't know. But I do the exact same thing. I tend to underwrite. My drafts are always shorter than my final thing. And that's because I usually go back to layer in more emotion and description and setting than I initially have. I tend to be really driven in a lot of ways, often by plot. So that's what's really kind of driving me through the story. And then I'm going back later and kind of adding in those other details. Other people are the opposite. I have one friend who's also a published writer, and her drafts are usually almost double the size of her final production, because she's loving all of that, and she loves to describe all of that. And then she has to kind of go back through and be like, okay, that was fun, but I don't need to do it. So she is one who kills a lot of darlings. But that's, kind kind of the fun of being a writer, is destroying the things that took you hours and hours to do. You sick bastard. All right. So the next question we have actually comes from Tony. And Tony was talking about, which is kind of an interesting way, of when do you do reveals? So Tony has several big reveals that are going to happen, which will turn the story as it kind of goes along. And when do you make those reveals? So I have a few thoughts of that in general, and then we can narrow in and see if we can be specifically helpful for you, Tony, which is, in general, first off, I think it's nice to have reveals happening a couple of times during the course of the book. Just because, particularly if you're writing some kind of thriller, there's that like, oh, and then we're on to kind of the next piece of information. But even if it's not a thriller, if you're writing a book, like there's some piece of information that kind of takes the story in a little bit of a different direction. So it's kind of turning the reader and being like, oh, I didn't know this was going to happen, or I didn't know this, piece of information was going to end up being important to the story, and it takes the characters. And you could certainly think of your own life where this might happen, where, you're going along to research some family history, and then you find out that your grandmother was actually involved in the war, and then you find out that she lied about her involvement in the war, and it was this other thing. So you can sort of see how reveals can kind of come along. I don't think what you want to do is clump them all up at the end, where it's like, aha, Peggy never knew this, but I am her mother, right? What? Peggy said, I didn't want to tell you, but I married Tony, who's your brother. So therefore, so all of a sudden there becomes all these sort of different pop-up reveals that feels almost like a cheat to the reader. So that's one thing to think about. The next thing, which I think is going to be, Alyssa.
So we're reading an Agatha Christie book for book club. And yeah, it's very much like, okay, now you're at the end. Now we're going to tell you everything. And I don't love that format.
Yeah, I think it was much more popular. I'm going to try and make the book club discussion tonight. It's great because I fly out tomorrow morning, so there's many things happening at this time. But one of the things that I find interesting when you read Agatha Christie novels is what worked as a mystery when she was writing them, because she was one of the first mystery writers that was out there. So things that eventually became cliches and tropes because she did them and developed them worked really well when she was writing them, right? But a lot of Agatha Christie comes where there's all of a sudden one reveal, and then there's this like trickle down. So that tells you this, and then someone else confesses to this, which confesses to this, and oh, by the way, they all did it. Like boom, 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 right? Which I think now readers would definitely have a pushback from, because it would feel like it's too tidy, and they would feel like they couldn't have figured it out. So things to think about in a reveal, which I think is really useful, is why is the character choosing to reveal it? And if it's because you need the reader to know this piece of information, that is not a good reason. So a reveal to its own sort of like, even when we think about describing it, a reveal is that idea where I'm suddenly going to tell you something, I'm revealing something about myself. Why would I do that? In general, the reveal isn't used for like, oh, you didn't know? Oh, here's this other thing. Like it's typically usually, I don't always want to say that it's a secret, but there's some kind of mystery behind it, something that's sort of happening. So if you are revealing it, why is the character choosing to do that at this time? So one of the things Tony was mentioning before we kind of got started, like, is the character going to lie? And I think a lie is often a good thing. So the reader finds out about the reveal because they get one piece of information that takes them down one path, and then they may discover that that is in fact not the case and it is something else. But they'll sort of follow that down to its sort of conclusion. But if a character is going to tell them the truth, so it's going to be like, bye, Peggy. So I'm going to confess to Peggy that I'm her mother, just as she walks out the door. Like, why am I choosing to tell her that now? Why am I revealing that secret? And there has to be a reason why I'm doing that. That either I'm going to reveal it because I know that Tony's found out about it and he's trying to blackmail me. So I want this all to come out before it comes back to bite me. Or something like that, where you're sort of seeing a reason to have that reveal. A plot reason other than you need the reader to know that, because that won't work. Tony, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I've got this somewhat complex plot that drags my character sort of against his will into a variety of places, and there's nobody revealing something. It's more there he's finding out things, and I'm just. But I do like, I don't want everything showing up at the end. Oh, it's this, and I'm your father, and you're my daughter. You're right, but at the same time, I do want to kind of have it so people go, oh, I didn't see that, right? And have it not like they throw the book across the room because they hated it, but that they were surprised, right? So it's a bit. I want to plant a couple of red herrings, and as I said, as I was going through it today, I'm revealing things too early.
You want the character to work for it.
Yeah. So that's and so this is helpful to kind of go through that whole process.
So, and the other thing to think about with a reveal is to play the idea as if you can plant something earlier where the reader will take it one way and then they see it from a different perspective and they realize something else. So the traditional romantic comedy is I come downstairs, I see Tony in an embrace with someone else. I'm devastated, right? Right. And then later we're going to find out that, of course, Tony was embracing someone who was his cousin. So now I realize, oh, it was just a friendly embrace between two good friends. So it's that kind of, oh, now I see this information in a different way. Or you overhear someone say something and you take it one way and then later you realize it wasn't meant that way. It wasn't. So sometimes thinking about a reveal where you've placed something, then it will sort of help that. If you want to have something and have a reader potentially overlook it, but then later go back and realize that it's there, as strange as it is, if you're listing items on the shelf, so I want, I'm going to have a gun go off in scene 3, act 3, right? So I'm describing the lodge that Alyssa's in. So I'll start like the fireplace was large, blah, 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 on the mantle, a gun, some photographs, something, and then end with something else in the scene. The reader is much more likely to remember the early part of things and the end part of things. In the middle will sometimes get lost in that description. So if you want to bury a red herring, look to stick it sometimes in the middle of a paragraph. Or if there's a piece of information, a blow dart, that's awesome. That's better than a gun. If you want to have, stick a piece of information in, let the characters finding out, I'm looking through some information and I see this, this, and this. And then I go back. And of course, later you want me to realize like, oh, now I realize this middle piece of information is the really important one. Then you can go back for that. Can you guys hear the one dog crying for dinner? Or is that just me? It's the saddest sound on the planet.
Almost dead. It's like I can barely,
She's like, oh God, I'm so hungry. So it's just pathetic and sad. I was hoping maybe nobody could hear it but me, but there you have it. So thinking about making your character work for a reveal, if it's information that they're digging out, making them potentially see the information or hear it or observe something that they picture in one way, and later another piece of information comes in that changes how they see it. It's the saddest sound on the planet. So there's that. And then bury it in the middle if you're trying to make it, or if you want to distract someone, like if you want to be, like you want everyone to think that the murder weapon is the blow dart, you might come in and be like, Tony walked into the lodge, he looked at the mantle, Alyssa had a large blow dart there, and then go on and describe other things and skip over that she also has something else up there that is eventually what's going to be the murder weapon. Because you'll distract them with the blow dart, and because readers will be like, aha, she's mentioning that. So like, for example, in You Owe Me a Murder, I wanted there to be the possible thing where the main character, Kim, has imagined Nikki the whole time, where she's actually going to have a moment where she's not sure. So if you go back and look through, she's always alone when she's talking to Nikki, pretty much. Like, you don't see Nikki really interacting with anyone else necessarily. So it could be like when you get to that point, and I do know that I had some readers who were like, oh, they thought they were sure they'd figured out, right? Like, oh, Nikki's not really there. It's all in her head. but Nikki is really there. Like she, just for the, spoiler alert. But that can be sort of a fun way to sort of play with the reader. If you know that you're writing thrillers where people are waiting for reveals and trip ups, is to say like, okay, what are they going to think is going to happen? How can I let them think I'm taking them down that road and then pull that away from me? And Bonnie has this, which I think is great, making the character convinced of one truth and then later they discover the real truth. But their conviction convinces the reader as well, right? Like the reader is like, oh, well, but if they think that, maybe I think that as well. Questions on reveals? All right. So we have a few minutes left. Does anyone have questions on anything else? It was Question-a-palooza this week. We're going to talk a little bit about emotion on the page. I think, Alyssa, you had mentioned, like, how do you get emotion on the page? This is one of those things that I think drives absolutely everyone crazy because we all get that feedback. More emotion, more emotion. I love writing that when I'm an editor because I just know I'm making other people's lives miserable too. Is to sort of think about a few different things. So I know you guys know all this, but thinking about the emotional thesaurus is a good place to start. So where, how does this emotion show up physically? Can sometimes help you get it onto the page. I think it's really useful to spend a few minutes and nail down, even if the character doesn't know, like what really is the emotion that they're feeling, because we often confuse a lot of emotions. So for example, a lot of men, if they're really scared, will sometimes come out as angry, right? So they will kind of, because it's not, manly to admit that you're frightened. And so they'll sometimes have this bluff or bluster. Women, we will sometimes cry when we're really, really angry because it's not socially acceptable to be lividly angry. If you've ever had the experience where you're bawling and someone's like, it's okay. And you're like, I'm actually mad. But you don't necessarily even know that emotion. So spending some time and figuring out, like, what does this character really feel? Like, are they irritated? Are they annoyed? Are they angry? Are they livid? Are they pissed as hell? Like, where are they? And then sort of even just thinking through yourself, like, how does that show up, right? Or think about other people that you know. So for example, I tend to get quite dramatic when I have strong feelings about stuff. But I knew someone who, for him, like the more upset he was, the colder that he got. Like the calmer he got, the less connected. Like you could tell he was really pissed when that would come out, and kind of how that played out. Or conversely, like my dad was a yeller. So it would be like, why would you do that? Right. And you'd be like, as a kid, at first it was really scary, but like by junior high age, you'd be like, yeah, I'm sorry, Dad. But like my mom could just look at you and be like, I am so disappointed. And it would be like, oh, like, because like for her, that was like a really cutting thing. So sort of thinking about how does that emotion show up, and think about other people you know and where they sort of react or don't react to that. And Bonnie has some great ideas here in terms of looking at how they perform an action or how they react when something happens to them is a great way of sort of showing emotion. So if, are their hands shaking as they do something? Are they, trying to get through something really quickly? Thinking about, again, I always think it's easiest to start with yourself. Like when you have that kind of emotion, how does that impact you? Where does it show up physically in your body? Are you someone who hurts in your shoulders and your neck? Are you sweating? Are your hands clenching? Does your stomach feel like it's going to puke? Where is that showing up for you physically? And then how do you react? So a good exercise might be, imagine that you're someplace and there's someone that you really, really like, and it seems like they might be flirting with you. So how does that feel for you to have that sort of excitement that someone's liking you? And then do you become really clumsy? Like that's the kind of the cliche thing, right? So, oh my gosh, he likes me. And then I spill my drink and and I trip over my own shoe and I fall backwards. And like the reader reading that knows, like, it's just that I'm giddy with excitement and nervous and all those kinds of things. But you could take it obviously in an opposite way, which I think is sometimes fun to play with, which is what if like the fact that someone likes me makes me like totally on lockdown. So I become like super like, that's very nice. How nice to see you. Well, I should be going. Goodbye. Right? Like where then the other character is going to be wondering what I feel. Did you want to add anything to your comment, Bonnie? I think that's a good one.
Okay, sorry, making dinner. Just sometimes we miss an opportunity to add in one more like internal thought. Like we'll take your example where you might see someone that you're interested in and they look like they're coming over and you feel all nervous and maybe you get a little bit of the jitters and you start talking really fast. And just to add in that one line of an internal thought that is like, oh my God, he's coming over and I'm going to puke my guts out. I got to talk fast so I don't throw up. Right. And it's just that little like explanation of what the physical reaction is. And it just somehow pulls them in that little bit more like, oh, now we're really in your head. Of course, you don't want to be in someone's head all the time because it can be kind of annoying. But but for those tense moments where you want to get the emotion on the page, or if somebody's saying, I'm not really connecting to your character, that's usually what's missing. It's just that little like, so their hands shook. What did that mean? Were they angry or were they scared? So they just need a little bit more of a hint of which it is.
And also, not even just which it is. Go back to making dinner, Bonnie. I hope it's good and you're making lots. But thanks, Tony. It's also letting us know and you guys have heard me talk about when I talk about backstory. It's not just what happens to a character, but it's the story that we tell ourselves about that. So cute guy is walking over to me and I'm nervous and excited, but is my internal thoughts like, okay, like I'm super excited. I can't believe I've been waiting for this. Or is it like, oh God, I'm going to blow this. I'm never good at these social interactions. He's never going to like me. Am I confident? Am I like, sometimes getting that internal thought also lets us know what's the story that I'm putting behind this. Like, do I think he's coming over only to be nice? Oh God, he's coming over because he feels bad for me because I'm standing by myself and he feels like he has to be nice. Like maybe I don't even realize that he's actually flirting with me. The reader knows it from what he's saying. Every other character for 10 miles knows it, but I don't know it because I haven't dated since I was 19 and I don't know what the hell I'm doing anymore, right? So that would be something that would be going on. Or if it was me that you were writing me as a character, you might be talking about like, I might even have the thought, like the last time I went on a date, I was 19. Like all I had to do was talk about the new Indiana Jones movie and I had him, right? Like now what do I do? What do I talk about? How do you date at 50 compared to 19? So you might have some internal thought that lets the reader know like what are my internal things around what I'm telling myself about what's going to happen in that scene. We'll sometimes kind of take that a little bit deeper. Other thoughts? I mean, I do find it, and I know I've given this advice to other people, but sometimes when I'm going back to add in emotion is I just write in the margin because I've printed off a rough draft. I write in the margin like what the emotion is that the character is supposed to be feeling. And I show how it might be changing. So it's like, no emotion or like calm, excited, scared, relieved. Like those are all the emotions they're going to go through in the scene. And then I just am going back through and asking myself, when they're feeling that thing, is there anything on the page that shows that or tells that or gives us that internal thing? Because I often, like, I know it, like, oh, they're just walking along and then they hear a sound, they're intrigued, they don't know what it is, they follow the sound, they realize it's a horde of zombies, they freak out, they're running, they don't know if they're going to make it, suddenly they're picked up by a helicopter and they're safe going over the bay, right? So that's what all happens in the scene. So I just want to be like, what can I do to show those different things at that different points in the story in that chapter? And that can just be a good reminder.
So if you're a counselor asking your character, how does this make you feel? And your says, I don't know. Do you have any follow-up questions?
Yes, I do. So I'm actually going to try it as if I was a counselor, right? So Alyssa, I've asked you to describe how you felt when your mom yelled at you. right? And I say, you know, listen, when your mom was talking to you about sneaking out of the house, how did that make you feel?
I don't know.
So sometimes I'll put out, and I'm like, well, I know for me, that might make me feel really disappointed and angry at my mom. Is that what you were feeling? So sometimes you can provide an emotion and ask them to push back on that, because some people don't know what they're feeling, but they will know if they're not feeling that thing, right? So you can sometimes put forward an emotion and be like, no, I wasn't mad at her. I was, and they might then insert something else. Or I might say, well, if you don't know how you felt about that emotionally, like, how did you feel in your body? Like, were you comfortable? Like, was your stomach bothering you at all? Did you have a headache? Like, well, I had a really bad headache. Oh, well, that's interesting. Well, what do you think might have caused? And sometimes it was like, well, I was just so frustrated, right? So I'm wondering if you're frustrated at your mom. So that can sometimes do that. Sometimes people find it easier. And again, as a counselor, this is a tricky, giving you guys all the secrets in case you end up in therapy at some point. Or already in therapy because we're writers and what the heck, we've probably been there for a while, is a lot of times I would say to someone, if your friend was in a similar experience, how do you think they would feel? Well, blah, 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 right? My friend would be, well, do you think you felt that way? No. Well, what do you think is different between you and your friend? So my friend Bonnie would be really mad if her mom was yelling at her. You know, oh, that's interesting, but you don't think you felt mad? No. Well, what do you think is different between you and Bonnie? Well, you know, Bonnie is really self-confident and she's not afraid to stick up for herself. And, you know, oh, so does that mean that you don't see yourself as self-confident? Do you maybe feel like your mom sometimes talks over you? And that's when they start crying. Yes, I don't know, right? But it is that thing. And I'm sure you've seen it happen where you'll see someone who might be, for example, in an abusive relationship. And you say to them, you know, if this was happening to your friend, what advice would you give to your friend? Like, I would tell your friend, you know, get out of there. That guy's a jerk, right? So why do you not tell yourself that? Right. And then what you're trying to dig at is at some point they don't think that they're worthy, right? There's something that they're telling themselves to stay in that thing. So sometimes you have to kind of backdoor into an emotion that way and asking them to compare it to someone else. Sometimes we'll help them do that. So for Sagaris, what do you think your sister would feel when this happened? Well, she would feel this and this, but you didn't feel that? No. Okay, well, what's different in that? And then you might start to dig down to what's really happening. So that may help.
Thank you. That's good. I think, yeah, even just going through and being like, is she angry? Is she sad? Is she annoyed? Trying to work that way might help. Yeah.
And even just kind of going through, like, you know, and look at a thesaurus, like for the words angry. I love when there's like this cat head comes in. But look at the, you know, the thesaurus for angry, and like, look at all the different terms for angry and ask yourself, like, where is she? Like, is she livid or irritated or, you know, like, there's so many different kinds of anger, and that changes how we feel about something, right? And is our emotion directed at the right thing? Like, is it that we're angry at our mom for yelling at us, but what we really are is angry at ourselves because of something else? So sometimes the emotions we have what we feel is more acceptable. Like, you know, we talked about, you know, men might confuse emotions, right? So it might be like a guy might say, I'm really pissed off, right? I can't believe the hospital's doing this and that. And what it really comes down to is that they're scared and they don't know how to fix this thing with their kid. And so it's easier to be angry at the doctors and the hospital administrators than it is to say, I don't know what's wrong with my kid and I'm terrified that it's not going to be okay. And I have to be the dude and, you know, make this all fine. So that can change that. And on that note, it is at a certain time for an evening meal. Some people around here would like it. So I will be flying tomorrow, so I'll be sort of hard to reach around that. But otherwise, I will be visiting my folks, so I'll be checking in on GLIP and all those things. So feel free to fire off questions. And otherwise, I will be back next week, same time, same place. All right. Take care, everybody.